Welcome to Global View. Joining us today, a journalist, a friend, a writer, a political commentator, and also the founder and editor of the 21st Century Wire. Welcome to Global View, Patrick.
Great to be with you, Simone and George.
I think I say your name fully. Today is a very important day for the United States and the globe because we have some breaking news, so many topics to discuss. I would like to start with this phone call that lasted 2 hours between President Trump and President Putin. It looks like the feedback from Trump's side was excellent. He truthed that as far as the peace negotiations are concerned, this is a topic that will be discussed by Putin and Zelensky themselves. But he also opened space for very interesting commercial perspective when it comes to the financial relationship between Russia and United States. I'd like to have your take on that.
Yeah, I saw the truth, or I like to call it a tweet, but we'll call it truth. But there's a lot packed in there. I mean, it's dense, so there's a lot on the menu there. I suppose I'm cautiously optimistic. This is a very complicated situation with Ukraine. A lot of different stakeholders, a lot of different actors, different camps within camps as well. So, you know, it's good that there's the most important thing is there's some dialogue open between the United States and Russia first and foremost. That's very important. So the fact that this administration has established that, overall, that's a positive. Even if the negotiations are problematic, it's an overall plus because we didn't have that during the last 3 years during the Biden administration, which makes things very dangerous if you think about the geopolitics and the fact that nuclear powers are involved. So any level of diplomacy, as even if it's ham-fisted, it's better than no diplomacy. So on this one, yeah, I mean, of course there's a lot of potential between the United States and Russia as future trading partners. I mean, there's no doubt, but they still have to get through some serious housekeeping items before you get there. I mean, from Russia's point of view, before I'm even talking about trade, I'm looking at the 320 billion in frozen assets held in Euroclear. Firstly, and then does Russia want to get back into the dollar or the dollar zone? Because as much as if you take the president's good intentions to want to settle this and so forth, as much as the good intentions might be there, in 2028, Donald Trump might not be, or he's not going to be in office. Who will replace him? If it's Tom Cotton or somebody like that, we could go back to the drawing board. If it's a Democrat, back to the drawing board. So there's that element to it. And I think if I was to be more critical, if I was advising this administration, I would really have an overhaul in how they're looking at this, the perspective they're taking. I think, talking about this as Biden's war and kind of stepping back as if you're kind of, an ancillary player in it or a bystander or an observer. I think that's good politically on the U.S. side. But internationally, it kind of almost handicaps you a little bit because Russia doesn't care. Russia's looking at it as this is Uncle Sam, just with a different person in the management seat. So the problem is, that can really handicap you in negotiations. I think Donald Trump, any U.S. president, whether it's Trump or whoever, if it was President Vance or if it was whoever, they have to own it. The U.S. has to own the fact that itself and NATO have been not just a third party, they're a co-belligerent in this conflict. And Trump's inherited it. Yes, he's inherited the conflict, but to be fair, he was also involved in his own way during his first term in helping to escalate things to get to. It's a multi-stage process from the Maidan coup in 2014. And of course, Simona, the films you've made on this, you're well steeped in the history. So I don't need to tell you. You just go look at the Everlasting Present or Revealing Ukraine or any of these fantastic productions that you have worked on with Igor Lopatinok. So, but that said, this is a very complicated story. So what the U.S. needs to do, I think what Russia needs to see is the U.S. Basically acknowledging that there's a political solution that has to happen. And that political solution is NATO is a big issue, we'll be honest. But it's not the way the U.S. is framing it, the U.S. team. And if I was to be very critical of the Trump team, they're framing this as like Russia's having a fight with Ukraine. I mean, J.D. Vance was, on the press pool on the plane. I think he tweeted that earlier today. It's like, oh, Putin doesn't know how to get out of this war. No, I think maybe Europe and NATO don't know how to get out of this war. I think Russia has very specific demands, which they outlined even before this war began. They have big existential security concerns. They have an extended security perimeter that's now extended more because of attacks within Russian territory over the last couple of years. And so that's increased the security threat to Russia. So as a nuclear power, they have to extend. And so that means they need security assurances that they're going to take themselves on the battlefield. And because there's been no diplomacy, and if there's no genuine diplomacy, then Russia's going to go for a military solution. And then it's going to be surrender terms. And I think the U.S. has to accept that there's kind of almost, if the U.S. was brokering surrender terms on behalf of Ukraine and Europe, I think that would be good. And I know we can't call it surrender terms, just to be fair, but I think that would be good because the reality on the ground is not good. The U.S. doesn't hold any cards, really. Europe doesn't hold any cards. There's going to be no ceasefire, because France and the Europeans and German and the British already telegraphed that they'll use a ceasefire to move troops in. And that's not good for Moscow. And frankly, it's probably not good for Ukraine either. So this is a really tough story historically, because things accelerated way beyond where I think they should have in 2022.
Patrick, very good insight. And I agree with you. I think things accelerated to the point that no one really expected them to reach the situation that they did, with hundreds of thousands, potentially millions of people dead. A country that's completely unrecognizable than what it was just 5 years ago, even less. So given that Putin is looking at the future of the U.S.-Russia relationship, who's going to be there after 2028? Obviously, it's not going to be President Trump, even though many people would like him to have a third term. It looks that that's not likely. And you have people like J.D. Vance, who hasn't been endorsed by the president. You have other people who might or might not throw their hat in the ring. You might have the Tom Cottons. You might have the Steve Bannons. You might have some dark horses that would like to basically ensconce this new reality that Trump is trying to create with Russia and other countries. But what is Putin's idea right now? Because the U.S.-Russia relationship, while many want to paint it as simply as part of the Russia-Ukraine war, it's actually very multifaceted. If you just look at the last 4 years, you've had Russia and China try to create BRICS to go up against the unipolar world, try to basically create a war against the US dollar. The China-Russia relationship is stronger than ever. The China-Russia-Iran relationship is stronger than ever before. So a lot has changed since Trump was president the first time. So the question along all that backdrop is, what is the ultimate grand bargain that Trump and Putin are seeking here? Is it myopic, meaning it's only looking at Russia-Ukraine war to have some sort of agreement, or will it cover Russia, China, Russia, Iran, BRICS, the future of BRICS, the petrodollar? What do you think is going on?
Yeah, I mean, I think the U.S. would like a grand bargain. I think they'd like a grand bargain with Russia right now. They'd want a grand bargain with Iran and a grand bargain with China. A grand bargain with Iran would be a new JCPOA that includes restrictions on missiles, on intercontinental missiles. It would all sorts of other caveats. For China, you've got Taiwan and maybe China's defense, some kind of, I think they would want, and I saw this was being telegraphed, was like an ABM INF treaty that included, China, Iran, Russia, as well as the West. I don't think they're going to get it because Russia likes to compartmentalize their negotiations. So they're very hyper focused on the details. And that's when you negotiate with Russia, they're not going to get sidetracked and project or get, off to the side and try to bring in some other element. No, they're very hyper focused on the situation in Donbass. Then they've got security concerns regarding NATO expansion, missiles that have 7-minute flight time to Moscow, right on their doorstep. Nuclear concerns, Zaporozhye nuclear plant. They're not going to let that go for the simple fact that they don't want to have uranium enrichment in the hands of this Ukrainian government, obviously. So that's a big security concern. So I don't think there's a grand bargain for United States and Russia. I really don't. It's going to have to be one step at a time, and that's really hard because that's tough work. And it's during the Cold War, Ronald Reagan, he could fall back on Richard Nixon. He could call Richard Nixon, oh, can you help me sort this out? He had Richard Nixon, he had George Shultz, he had Zbigniew Brzezinski, he had Cyrus Vance, he had Jimmy Carter if he needed him. It's who does Donald Trump have? This is the problem with Trump is the intentions are good. I think he's articulated solutions that I think are in the right direction, but I don't think the skill set is there with the team to execute it. They have a lot of plates in the air. I mean, that's an understatement. They're really doing a major balancing act, and to pull off that type of high wire act, you need some real diplomatic skill and talent, and that's a different skill set, I think, than is currently present in the cabinet. And I think that's a big disadvantage because you look at what's on the Russian side. These are people that they're career diplomats. So like when they go into negotiations, they know like for the Iran negotiations, for example, previous U.S. administrations, I would say up to maybe George Bush Jr. You had Larry Wilkinson and some really competent Colin Powell. These are very high-level operators. They would know the history of all of the neighboring countries. They would know all the conflict status, the military history. They would know the political history. They would know the culture, the geopolitics, going right back, in some cases, to the beginning of that civilization in terms. So they're going into negotiations with that level of familiarity with the other side. And also with regards to trying to, broker a deal. And on the Iranian side, it's the same. And on the Russian side, you better believe they know every single blade of grass in that region. And they know the history of the Kursk battles in World War II. So for them, they're replaying history. This latest conflict in Ukraine is just replaying history. The U.S. Donald Trump's administration hasn't brought that type of team together. And this is a big problem. It means they're going to be playing catch up continually. And they might get there in the end, but not now, but maybe in 6 months or a year. But the risk is what can happen in the meantime, especially with an unstable Ukrainian government like Zelensky. Zelensky and Budanov and some of these guys, I mean, these are real fanatics that have been and have tons of free money and U.S. dollars injected into their political system, wildly corrupt. I think we all understand that. And I think it's really distorted their thinking in Kiev. They're kind of on steroids. Ukraine's like that little guy in the gym that's pumped up, doing power lifts and pumped up on steroids, but wants to pick a fight with everybody in the gym, but himself is not really capable. And unfortunately, that's the status right now until there's a change of government in Kiev. And that Russia rightly doesn't want to proceed forward. They don't view Zelensky as the legitimate leader, doesn't have a mandate. And that's a legitimate concern. So can we address some of these things? I'm not sure if the U.S. should have taken the lead and just told him to take a hike, like from day one. And past U.S. administrations have done that. They said, when are elections going to happen? You remember, anytime there's a coup, when are elections happening? That didn't happen in this case. And I think that's a huge stumbling block.
Well, Patrick, I think a huge part of the problem is that the propaganda machine didn't train the audience to understand those issues. As somebody who worked in the region as well as you did, and George with his political expertise in foreign policy, we had a complete understanding of what was happening and the level of meddling and influence of the West, not only from the US side, but also from the Europe side, something I'd like to discuss with you shortly, on the region of Ukraine. So we have this land, this piece of land that has a geopolitical impact and is of a real big importance already under Obama administration, when Biden, as vice president, already was meddling his influence. And we know that everyone who got involved into exposing any wrongdoing of Biden and his family in this region has suffered the legal consequences and media labeling as some sort of Russian operative. Now we know that all this was false, but we didn't have a media machine to counter fight this effort to basically label everything that was happening in this area under the label of propaganda, the machine of propaganda. Now, finally, people are waking up. But we have Donald Trump coming into the picture with his business mind, treating every issue as a deal, and is finally opening a dialogue with Putin and Russia. And I understand the concerns on the diplomatic side about that you just expressed, but him in his incredible presence is bringing up the unspeakable monster Russia into the game and finally saying Russia has unlimited potential. I mean, having the president of the United States speaking so highly about the potential of the country that the entire West tried to delete from geopolitical map, I think was a big deal. So what do you think about people like Ursula von der Leyen that woke up today and finally praised Donald Trump on social media, or Giorgia Meloni trying to have a dialogue with JD Vance and Ursula von der Leyen at the same table? Don't you think it's a little disingenuous, or it just shows that there is no political integrity or message on the European Union side?
Well, the last part of that comment, Simone, is absolutely true. There's zero integrity on the European side, and also this is probably the weakest crop of European leaders, probably in recent and maybe in history of modern Europe. I mean, these are all kind of performative technocrats, and in some cases, people promoted. In the EU, obviously, they're not Kalia Kallas from Estonia, population 1.5 million, and she's the head of foreign policy for the EU, and very, very anti-Russian. So, she doesn't speak for Europe. And what I think America needs to not forget is that historically, America and Russia have been not just allies. Russia's relationship with the United States from day one of the founding of the country has been pivotal in the development of the United States in continental North America. And at a time when the U.S. was being undermined by the French and the British, Russia was always there for the U.S. And in World War I, World War II, the U.S. has been allied, been brothers in arms with the Soviet Union, with Russia ostensibly. You can't forget that. I cannot say the same for the leading powers of Europe. They have often, especially Germany and the Axis powers, have been absolutely against Russia. And the British have always tried to, you know, in some ways, I think, playing the role of historically of agent provocateur in European geopolitics to ensure that Germany and Russia could never have any type of relationship geopolitically. And I think that was in the interest of the British Empire, quite frankly, to maintain their hegemony. And that type of worldview got handed down through, you know, Halford Mackinder, through Zbigniew Brzezinski, and that was the dominant thinking of the Eurasian, the domination of the Eurasian landmass and the Silk Road, and preventing the Silk Road from happening. So America is still stuck in this past, and Europe has been, you know, kind of vassalized since the Second World War. So they still have training wheels on their bike. I think politically and geopolitically, that needs to change. They're still militarily occupied. I mean, the U.S. has huge military footprint in Germany, in Italy via NATO, and a bunch of other countries in Europe. So that's not going to be easy to, I think, tease that apart. The rhetoric seems to be anti-European from people like J.D. Vance and so forth, but the reality is the U.S. have a very, very strong, massive military presence in Europe. So what Europe yeah,
Italy.
go. Oh, in Italy, it's huge. It's absolutely huge. You could say Italy's kind of occupied in some senses. So for Giorgia Meloni, she has to deal with that reality. They're stuck with NATO. There was, when Federica Mogherini, as we were speaking offline before, the former High Representative to the European Union on Foreign Affairs. So when she was, as you know, right up till about 2019, the European Collective Defense and the PESCO agreement, she was instrumental, I think, in helping put that together. That was seen by the United States at the time as a potential rival to NATO in terms of the military organizational power in Europe. And that came to a grinding halt because of COVID. In 2020, all of that basically went in the back burner. And then the Ukraine crisis began. And then European military integration went really on the back burner after that. And NATO came right to the forefront. Nord Stream pipelines. All of a sudden, NATO becomes the most dominant political, economic, and military institution for Europe, really kind of directing Europe. So NATO became the glove, it was always the glove that I think the US could have its hand in to steer European affairs post-World War II. And the British too. The British have always been number two, second in command. So Supreme Allied Commander, US, second in command was always British. I know they're looking at changing that now. I think that's potentially important, but it's a bit of a paradox because leaving Europe to its own devices, let's just say a rogue actor in Europe could create a situation, even if the U.S. pulled itself out, that could end up dragging the U.S. back into a bigger conflict in order to somehow, and that's happened in history twice. And you know, that's this type of thing I think we want to avoid. I think if there's a pragmatic, smart U.S. administration in power, NATO can work. If there's a smart, wise, restrained, and responsible U.S. administration, NATO can work. But unfortunately, I don't know where this anti-Russian gene is coming from in the current European framework, but it's very dangerous because and if they're able to, if they believe that somehow they can use Article 5 as a trap and they can bait Russia, they've extended the line now, Finland, Sweden, right down to Romania. It's Poland. Poland is very militarized now. So this is as you're saying, George, this is a very different situation. And it seems like the line of contact of the Cold War, which was East Berlin, is way further east now. So, the military industrial complex could claim a victory right now if things stopped, because the line of contact they've militarized the entire European theater right down to the Bosphorus, basically, in a way that's even more than the Cold War.
Patrick, you mentioned the militarization of Eastern Europe. You mentioned Romania. There's been a lot of activity recently in Romania. You just had this contested election that's basically pinned the future of Romania, and I would argue the Balkans, almost Eastern Europe, between the pro-EU NATO camp and the so-called pro-Russia camp. What are you hearing about what is really going on or what happened in Romania? Why is Romania and Moldova being such a contested zone between Russia and NATO, if you will? What's going on?
It's a good point. Romania is the hot spot right now, no doubt about that. It's interesting. If you look, when you listen to the rhetoric in Europe, everybody that's furthest away from the conflict is the most vociferous, loud, and hawkish. And the countries that are right on Ukraine, like Slovakia, like Hungary, they're the most pragmatic and sensible in what they're talking about right now. Romania could be like Hungary and Slovakia, but there's a lot of political meddling going on, and that started, it really ramped up under the Biden administration. And USAID, before it was, temporarily dismantled, I don't know if it's permanently dismantled, but let's just say temporarily dismantled for now. But that was a big part of the meddling in the Romanian election, in the same way that it is used in Georgia and some of these other places. So between George Soros, Open Society, some of these USAID sort of Trojan horses that Samantha Power had deployed all over Europe to destabilize and to get the preferred political outcomes that I think that previous U.S. administrations wanted, that NATO wanted, that the British wanted, that Brussels wanted. And you're seeing that play out. And they really went all out in Romania, because the reason is there's so much money invested in new military bases, and the French have a big stake in this, okay, for logistics, for construction. So there's a lot of money tied up in the expansion of NATO's footprint in Romania. But strategically, think about it. It's really pivotal. And this is why you're seeing we're right at the end here, because if Russia manages to take, let's say when they say take Odessa and this part of the Black Sea coastline, that's kind of game over for NATO for the southern flank. It's kind of game over. But if it's still alive, then there's always a potential for future conflict and instability, which again keeps NATO alive. And Romania becomes the staging ground for all of that. Russia would then join up from Odessa to Transnistria, and then Moldova is historically Russian. So it's naturally should fall into the Russian sphere of influence, but then it becomes a battleground because Europe will do anything to make sure that doesn't happen. And they'll put, and they have been putting everything into that. So the political outcomes you see in some of these places doesn't reflect, like Romania, like Moldova, doesn't necessarily reflect I think the will of the people, the historical, cultural fealty with Russia, linguistically, culturally, and perhaps politically, because this isn't Soviet Russia anymore. This is a new Russia, which has potentially a lot more to offer allied countries in its orbit than maybe the Soviet Union did. And beyond protection, economically, energy, all these relationships that Russia, and the only thing left for Europe to dangle is EU membership or a NATO membership, and that's really a protection racket for anybody that wants to fall into that camp. And so what Russia's offering is cheap, affordable natural gas, energy, and good relations, and potential gateway to Asia. Um, uh, and China, good relations with China. So these barriers are going to have to come down at some point because, I think the world's changing. I think there's a lot of opportunity. The center of gravity is moving eastwards economically. Europe can benefit tremendously from this, but at the expense of the United States. And I think this is the rub. It's always been the rub for 300 years.
You mentioned the gene of the Russia phobia in Europe, and you made some historical links to that. In particular, in Italy, the country I'm from, we never had any major issue with Russia, actually, where Russia is the biggest export in Italy of natural gas, and we have plenty of international relationship. But at the time of Berlusconi, we were pretty public. Now, when we talk about this propaganda and the level of probably delusions, collective delusions that it's produced by propaganda, some were speculating over Europe that Putin had Tsar ambitions and would expand after Ukraine to France, Italy, Belgium. I mean, how crazy is this narrative, and how do you think it's even possible that anyone would buy into that?
Well, I don't think Russia has any designs past eastern Ukraine, quite frankly. But if you polled some people in Europe, would they prefer to have Vladimir Putin as their head of state or who their current head of state is? I think you'd be surprised at the result in some European countries. That's not to say that Russia is interested in governing any of these places, not even Western Ukraine. That's a bridge too far. Poland, forget it. Even the Baltic states, there's so much anti-Russian toxicity there. That's the last thing they'd want to deal with. What Russia's clearly wants, they signal, is they want to have good, cordial, pragmatic, sensible, mutually beneficial relations with these countries. But this has always gone against the Western NATO agenda because NATO is expansive. The European Union is expansive. It's got a Department of Enlargement in Brussels. And so, I mean, they're kind of obvious what they want. They want to expand. And then the West will say, NATO proponents will say, oh, it's just a defensive alliance. And, we want to bring peace and defend democracy. And that's why we're expanding. It's for the good of humanity. Of course, Russia's not looking at it that way, and rightfully so. I think Ukraine has really been the revelation of the method for NATO, and I think NATO potentially Ukraine is an existential moment for NATO. If they already have, I believe they've kind of already blown it, but when it's official that they've lost in Ukraine, this could be the end of NATO. It really could shrivel up and die at that point. And that's why I think that they're so irrational. The rhetoric is so hyperbolic. It's so crazy. I think because there's just so many people have so much tied up in it. And all these European leaders, whether it's Mark Rutte, whether it's Emmanuel Macron, or Olaf Scholz or Friedrich Merz or Kali Kallis or whoever, they're really using Ukraine is like the only thing that binds Europe together. It's the only thing they ever agree on. And the UK is back in Europe, and Brexit wounds have been healed and forgiven, and Keir Starmer's in there behind Zelensky, and they love the photo ops. There's another historic photo op, then Monday another historic photo op, and etc. Thousands of historic photo ops every week, and but it's fake. It's an illusion. There's no substance to it because Europe has real structural economic problems, and which have been exacerbated by sanctions against Russia.
That's true. We've seen inflation as never before in the last 2 years.
Yeah.
Patrick, I want to gravitate to the Balkans, another hotspot between NATO, the US potentially, and Russia. There's been a lot of conflict and a lot of tension on Serbia, Kosovo, North Macedonia, all of these countries as some sort of new battleground for either influence or pipeline routes or energy deals or military deals, even with China. Do you think that the Balkans are a new frontier of potential conflict once the Ukrainian war obviously comes to complete and utter halt?
I think the Balkans are always going to be potential for conflict, and they've always been a potential for conflict for Europe for 1,000 years, and it's no different today. I think one of the best things I think I saw was during the VE Day celebration in Moscow, that President Vučić from Serbia gave the statement that he gave, which really showed solidarity. And I think because there is a very strong historical, spiritual connection between Russia and Serbia historically, the Orthodox Church as well. These are not insignificant things for people that live in the region. The West maybe doesn't understand them fully to understand how strong those historic bonds are. And so that is not trivial, because there's a lot of effort to, especially Serbia, to try to pull Serbia into Europe and into NATO. And this pressure has been laid on them for the longest time. And but what you said, George, I think is the key. You mentioned all these smaller states, which really complicates things. And it almost creates this type of paralysis, the type of paralysis we see in the Middle East post Sykes-Picot. Things would be a lot easier maybe if there was greater Syria, as it was after the fall of the Ottoman Empire for a short period of time, or Yugoslavia, one government, one country that you could negotiate with. But all of these things have been shattered for geopolitical reasons over the last generations, and it becomes more complicated, because while some of these smaller states have been subservient to Brussels, to Washington, to London, in many ways, but they also develop their own political programs, and they have their own sort of power bases that develop. And all of a sudden you have to, it's full-on negotiations with 6 different countries. And it just makes things a lot more difficult to get to a consensus. This is the European problem, I think, full stop, is consensus, political consensus. And they've tried so many different methods to, through NATO or through Brussels, through the EU, to try to force that consensus. But to me, the biggest enemy of prosperity and success in Europe has been intervention to, meddle in elections, to break up governments and states post World War II. To me, it's been a disaster. And Yugoslavia, while it was not a natural country, but on other levels, it was very successful in many ways. It was a hybrid economy, capitalist, socialist hybrid. But now it's shattered to the 4 corners of Central Europe. So, yeah, I don't know. I think this is going to be a problem. I mean, the bigger states have the ready-made solutions. Russia is the biggest technically, it's the biggest European country, if you count them in Europe. And they have the ready-made solution for Europe. And Europe was benefiting from that. I mean, look, and so you talk about inflation, you talk about energy costs. Now you have offshoring of German industry as a direct result of these things that we mentioned before. Should never have happened. And Northern Europe needs to be prosperous because it subsidizes to a large degree Southern Europe, or the ECB, and Germany is able to bail out other economies that might be struggling. So it's it's really unfortunate, I think, and it'd be nice to see the type of statesman, a Gerhard Schroeder, a Francois Mitterrand, but these are nationalists, and that runs contrary to Brussels. This is a real problem right now in Europe.
Yeah, indeed, we have a union that lacks a constitution, lacks an army, but it's all there united in defending a non-member state, Ukraine, from so-called aggressor Russia. So when we think about Ukraine is no member of the European Union, is non-member of NATO, but we have all these forces united and allocating resources, financial resources and military aids to Ukraine, that tells you a lot about how to dig and where to dig to understand the real nature of this geopolitical conflict. But thank you so much, Patrick. It was such a pleasure to have you on. And on my side, this was my last observation. I don't know if you, George, have more, or we can just skip into knowing where people can find you.
Mhm. Yeah, you can go to 21stcenturywire.com. That's our main, hub. But we have channels on YouTube and Rumble and Twitter at 21wire. It's my X Twitter account as well. It's kind of everything's fed through there. Instagram 21wire as well on Instagram. So yeah, we got putting out videos every day, putting out articles, doing research as well. We have a research cohort and publish our research almost every day at 21st Century Wire. There's always something in there, and doing a lot of different geopolitical areas and stuff like that. So yeah, I'm a generalist, really. I'm interested in a lot of different areas, which is a little bit difficult because everyone loves specialists these days. But I'm kind of like, I can't help myself. I just like being a generalist, but it's tough.
Well, you were definitely not general in your answers. You covered a lot of ground, and I think people are going to be very well informed in numerous hotspots around the world based on this interview. So thanks again, Patrick, and we look forward to having you again soon. Thank you.
Thank
Thanks.
you, Dan.